traditional, super fun, and all about artisan cheese and more to melt your peaceful heart and toast your peaceful life. Coming to you from the Appalachian Mountains of southwestern Virginia, this is the Peaceful Heart Farmcast.
Hey, this is Scott Hall from Peaceful Heart Farm, and you are listening to the Peaceful Heart Farmcast.
Hello, everybody. Melanie Hall here. I hope you are doing very, very well. The conversation today and every day revolves around the value of tradition, traditional food prep and storage, traditional cooking, the new traditional farming practices, and of course, traditional artisan cheese. Topics discussed here are designed to create new perspectives and possibilities for how you might add the taste of tradition to your life. In today's show, we're going to talk about cooking through the ages. We're going to go from the Stone Age all the way to our modern age. And then I'm going to put a little twist and have like a mixture of that. So anyway, today we'll have some the Homestead life updates. We'll go cooking through the ages. And I'm going to have a very special recipe today. It's a cornmeal bread, but the recipe is from a book I have about how to cook using a fireplace hearth. All right, so that should be fun. Let's talk about our Homestead life updates first. It is snowing again today. Sigh. Will this winter ever end? All right, as far as the creamery, the trough drain that's used to carry waste away from cows doing their thing while we're milking them has a brand new cover, and it's covered with molded fiberglass resin floor grates, and these are strong, non-slip, non-rust grates, and they look really cool to me. The walls in the creamery are going up slowly, very slowly. It is still winter, and the weather is impeding our progress there. The orchard, that's a regular winter task, pruning the fruit and nut trees in the orchard, trimming and repositioning the canes and the blackberries and so on. Done. Other projects that interfere with getting the creamery done. Number one, we're going to be trying a new method of separating calves from moms this year, and how are we going to handle that? And so now we've determined we need to have a calf pen. So Scott's going to have to build a calf pen. And number two, we eat a lot of eggs around here, but chickens are still on the back burner. Instead, we're going to raise quail for eggs and likely some meat there as well. And that decision, it's based on time restrictions in building that chicken infrastructure. Making quail cages is much quicker. And the birds are easy to raise, or so they say. We shall see. This is my project. Scott will build a couple of cages. Probably, hopefully, no more than a half a day invested in that, but everything else is going to be up to me. And the incubator is on its way. It'll be here later this month, and then we'll order some eggs and get going on that. All right, let's talk about cooking through the ages. As a people, how did we get to the point that we are today, the food that we have and the implements that we have to cook that food, and where did we start from? So we're going to actually take a quick trip through thousands of years of history and see how did we humans survive as a species? What kind of food did we eat? How did we prepare and preserve it? How did we get to where we are now? We're going to start with the Stone Age. So during the Stone Age, the Paleolithic period, or the Old Stone Age, beginning as early as 750,000 BC, and the Neolithic period, or the New Stone Age, began around 8,000 BC. So humans began to make and use stone tools and acquire a larger variety of foods, so they were doing all of that in new ways. Now, the Paleolithic tools and foods, so the Paleolithic tools included axes and blades for cutting and chopping. And again, these are made of stone and bone. And in order to survive during the Paleolithic period, humans hunted wild animals, birds, and fish. They collected nuts, fruits, and berries. Artifacts show that people ate mammoth, reindeer, horse, fox, wolf, and tortoise. Cooking techniques included broiling or roasting food over an open flame or hot coals, and braising in clay cylinders over ashes in a pit is also indicated, and that would be in the later periods. So when the Neolithic food revolution came around, one of the most significant changes in human food habits occurred. So this is around 8000 BC, and where people began to grow food rather than gather it. And this is the Neolithic period. Humans started raising cereal crops such as rye and wheat. We began keeping livestock, including pigs, cows, goats, and sheep. Archaeologists have discovered millstones in these areas as they're excavating, and there's an indication that Neolithic peoples were grinding wheat and other grains to make flour for bread. Changes in cooking methods included using water brought to a boil in earthenware pottery, and they also built the first closed ovens for baking. Now let's move on to the Bronze Age and some of the other earlier civilizations. You had advances in food production and preparation, and they had a broad reach. People in Northern Europe began to farm sometime around or after 3000 BC. Farming practices advanced with the invention of the plow, and that was about 3550 BC, and food production increased. In the Bronze Age, it began around 3000 BC in the Mediterranean areas. People began to cook using liquid in pots of copper and bronze, and new tools and utensils also became available. So we're still using the same cooking methods at this time, although they do have some closed-in brick ovens. All right, let's talk about Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. We humans were figuring out what it took to survive as a species, and we're banding together in larger and larger groups, and so that leads to early civilizations. And Mesopotamia and Egypt are two that we know about. And these two civilizations shared some food habits and traditions. Although beef, lamb, pork, deer, and fowl, excluding chicken, fish, turtles, vegetables, and fruits, those were all part of their diet. Grains were also a staple food. Besides cooking cereals in water as a porridge and using ground grains to make bread, the Mesopotamians favored beer as a beverage for festive occasions. And then you have inscriptions on Egyptian tombs. "Give me bread when I am hungry. Give me beer when I am thirsty." And those bear witness to the heavy use of grain in the ancient Egyptian diet. Now, both the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians developed a system of writing early on, and thus they had the means to record recipes. The first known recipes come from Mesopotamia and date to the 2nd millennium BC. Excavated tombs have yielded remnants of food such as figs and bread. Those are typical funerary offerings. Ancient Egyptian food preparation methods such as open hearth baking of unleavened bread and salt preservation of meats and fish are still common today. And the Egyptians also dried and smoked foods and stored fruits in honey and fish in oil to preserve them. So we've got the beginnings of food preservation there. And now let's move a little bit farther forward into the Greek and Roman eras. As I mentioned in the History of Cheese Farmcast, the Greeks made cheeses. They also baked bread and produced wine. They became skilled in the use of seasoning and spices. They made sauces using oil and cheese and cultivated olives. Meat such as rabbit was added to the diet and gained in popularity during that time. They were influenced in large part by the ideas of the great physician and teacher Hippocrates. And the Greek and later the Romans focused on eating a healthful diet, consuming food items for both medicinal and nutritional purposes. So they viewed cooking methods, combinations of food, drink, and seasonings as contributions to overall well-being. And the Greeks introduced a tradition of lavish dinner parties or banquets, which were often followed by a symposium. the ritual consumption of wine. The typical Roman kitchen, the master cook supervised the food preparation from a platform at the rear of the room, and square hearth fires stood in the middle. Kitchen equipment featured pots made of bronze, brass, clay, or silver, as well as ovens that were fired with wood. Formal dining traditions were further developed during the Roman Empire. So now we're starting to get etiquette and creating specific feasts and meals. Now let's jump a little bit farther forward into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So Roman traditions continued to dominate cooking and dining practices all the way through the Middle Ages. Another important tradition that began during this period was the formation of culinary guilds, and this gave chefs a sense of community. And during the Renaissance, advances in the culinary arts helped set the stage for the development of modern cookery. So developing recipes and developing various meals all around Europe and the Middle East. So medieval kitchens typically stood apart from the main house to reduce the risk of fire. The traditional kitchen, it was crowded, noisy, hot, smoky. Vents in the ceiling allowed the release of smoke and heat from the roasting pit and simmering iron kettles. Cooks kept food cold in cellars. Kitchen equipment included iron pots as well as various hooks and spoons and knives. So the Iron Age, now we're into the Iron Age, and produced the cauldron, an iron vessel hanging from a metal arm over hot coals. And that was the main cooking pot. Right? So you've got this metal arm, sometimes called a crane. The typical chimney hearth could accommodate 3 cauldrons. The cauldron on the left side of the hearth was used for roasting, and the others were used for boiling. Breads and pies would be baked in an oven on the side of the chimney. And of course, these are in the city. Out in the countryside, they're pretty much typically just doing hearth cooking, and they're baking in the hearth as well, which we're going to get to later. Some Renaissance developments. The late 1300s marked the beginning of the Renaissance, an era of revival in the arts and sciences, and it spread across Europe, south to north. So Italy dominated in the south the culinary scene in the 1400s, and by the end of the century, though, it had shifted up to Spain, whose explorations and conquests in the Americas introduced new foods and methods of food preparation into Europe. So they go out and they are exploring around the world, and they're bringing those things back to Europe. Christopher Columbus, Hernando Cortez, as well as other explorers and conquistadors returned to Europe. They brought tomatoes, chili peppers, potatoes, avocados, corn, vanilla beans, and cacao, which is the main ingredient of chocolate. So these food items had a lasting impact on the European cuisine. And then by the late 1500s, France rose as Europe's culinary center. All right, so enough about Europe. Let's move on to America. So it's at this time, while the Grand Cuisine is taking shape in France, that American cuisine is only in its infancies. There are no cities. European settlers in America brought familiar cooking methods and some food staples from the old world with them, and then they combined these with the culinary techniques and ingredients they found in the New World. So from the very start, American cookery has been a mosaic of ingredients and techniques from a variety of cultures. When Columbus arrived in the Americas in the late 1400s, most Native Americans followed traditional practices, and remember, they are still in the Stone Age as well. Their main crops were maize or corn, beans, and squash, but other valuable crops included potatoes and sweet potatoes. They had domesticated, actually they didn't have. Domesticated animals were not a large source of food. However, in addition to their cultivated crops, they fished and hunted and collected other foods. And so, again, they're in the Stone Age as far as their tools and equipment. And they developed storage for pits for grains, nuts, and other foods. They used a variety of cooking techniques, including roasting and boiling in pots. And they preserved some foods by drying and smoking. Again, you go back to the Paleolithic, the Neolithic time, and you'll see that that's the same. They were in that stage of evolution in their ability to prepare and store food. So now the colonial food habits, you have these European settlers, they learned a great deal from indigenous peoples about growing and preparing foods native to the New World. The Native Americans taught these newcomers from Europe the most efficient way to cook outdoors, how to prepare beans and cornbread, succotash, and various soups and stews became part of the colonial cooking repertoire. And for their part, Europeans changed the food supply in the Americas, introducing livestock such as pigs, cattle, and sheep, and plant food such as rice, wheat, barley, and broad beans from Europe. So there was a huge exchange there that was happening there. And soon the colonists were pretty comfortable preparing a variety of foods using a blend of Native American and European techniques. Now, let me just talk briefly about the regional cuisine that happened in America and kind of how that happened. So during the vast land expansion in the 19th century, the American diet began to show variety from one geographic region to the next. Each part of the country developed its own regional cuisine, the foods, the ingredients, cooking methods, and characteristic of a particular geographic region. And several factors contributed to that. You had the availability of local ingredients and the influence of cultural groups. Immigration in the 19th century changed America as cities began to flourish. Nearly 5 million immigrants arrived in the United States in the period between 1830 and 1860. That's just 30 years. Most were from Germany, Great Britain, and Ireland, and then two waves of immigration after 1860 brought people from Scandinavian countries and from Italy, Austria, Hungary, Russia, Greece, Poland, Portugal, and Spain. Then you had Asian immigrants also began to make a home in America's big cities. And so this is how the various regional cuisines began to take shape. And let me just kind of go over a few of those real quick. The Northeast was influenced by Native Americans and Englishmen, French Canadians, Italians, and the Portuguese. And some of the regional foods they developed include meat pies, fish stews and soups, clam chowder, salt cod, chorizo and peppers, baked beans, succotash, Indian pudding, brown bread, maple syrup, cider, fruit pies and desserts, and cream dishes. And later, cheese would become a really valuable product for this region. In the Mid-Atlantic, you had schnitzel and scrapple and sausages, apple butter, sauerkraut, slaw, pretzels, bagels, waffles, pork, and dairy products, and those came out of Dutch and German influences. Moving into the Midwest, this is like Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Minnesota. That's the Midwest, in case you're wondering. You're going to find there you had the development of jerky, country ham, sausages, gravies, beef stews and pot pies, meatloaf, corn roasts, freshwater fish, cheese, of course, potatoes, root vegetables, rye and pumpernickel bread, wild rice, pancakes, strudel, applesauce, apple juice, sauerkraut, nut candies, poppy seed cake, and lager beer. Influences there included Native American, Polish, Hungarian, Czech, German, and Scandinavian. Now the southern region is large and varied. You have things there like Brunswick stew, country hams, red-eye gravy, cornbread biscuit, barbecue pork and beef, chicken wings, jambalaya, fried chicken, crab cakes, crab and crawfish boils, catfish, butterbean custard, peanut soup, peach pie, key lime pie, greens with fatback or salt pork, fried okra stews, hominy, grits, gumbos, sweet potato pie, nut cakes, and rice. Now this wide variety is due to Scots-Irish, English, Welsh, French, Creole, the Cajun, and African influences. The West is an even larger area, and it is even more varied in its immigrant influences because now you're introducing cuisine from the Far East. What a variety. You got Native American, Spanish, Mexican, Chinese, Japanese, and the Pacific Islands all have contributed to what we have in the West today. You have barbecue, corn dishes, you have Tex-Mex food, chili con carne, citrus fruits, guacamole, olives, tuna, sourdough bread, steaks, game, grilled lamb, teriyaki, luau pork, salmon chowder, sashimi, fry bread, Asian noodle dishes, stir-fry dishes, tortillas, tacos, quesadilla, chimichangas. You have pineapple and sugarcane and chilies prepared in all sorts of ways. So we have such a variety throughout the United States because of these various influences and areas where people move to. Now let's talk briefly about the changes in food production because it was really very focused on the farming techniques once we got to the farming. First it was hunter-gathering, then it was farming. But then you had new ideas and technology in the 1800s, and that had a great impact on agriculture and industry. So established cities are growing rapidly, so you need the ability to grow more food and to transport it farther to get it to more people. And today it's the trucking industry, but back then it was the trains that were paramount to people in the city having access to food. You had improved tools, you had new farming methods. Not necessarily the best, but they were there. You had the development of farm machines, including tractors and combines and cultivators. And so you have this increased supply of food while you're decreasing the need for small farmers. And hopefully we're making a big comeback there. But the 19th and 20th centuries were a time of great change in the United States. The Industrial Revolution introduced machines that transformed farming and manufacturing. Large numbers of people continued to move to the city. They moved from rural areas to the city, and this move accelerated, and fewer farmers grew our food till today. I mean, it used to be at the turn of the 20th century that was like 80% of the people were farmers, and today it's like less than 5%, I think. So the supply of food increased exponentially, but more and more people became separated from the source of their nourishment, where it used to be 80% of people were directly in touch with their food. You had electricity and gas, the creation of modern appliances. Those are all the icing on the cake. Harvesting, storing, preparing food. It's a breeze today compared to days past. So that's a really quick journey that from the Stone Age all the way to modern times, we went from primitive stone implements right up to modern cooking and preservation equipment. And I want to step back a little and fill in a blank or two regarding early colonial American cooking, specifically on baking bread on the hearth. As I said, it's going to tie in with today's recipe. So you had these people that are coming from Europe where you had we're in the Iron Age, and we had, in the rural areas, I'm sure there was still a lot of hearthside cooking. But once you came to America, that's all there was. You were either cooking outside or you were cooking on your fireplace inside. So we're going to talk about bread making in colonial Virginia. Hot breads were presented as part of elaborate meals that were served at the Virginia plantations in the 18th and 19th centuries. So guests often left descriptions of the foods they had enjoyed. Excellent wheat breads were highly praised, but cornmeal breads predominated, and white cornmeal was most often used in the South. As part of the ritual of good food provided in plenty by wealthy Virginians, an array of well-made breads was essential. They were brought to the table to be slathered with fresh butter and eaten still warm from the oven. Is your mouth watering? Now, let's consider how formidable it was to make bread. There were no handy grocery stores to pick up a loaf on the way home. There's no packets of dried yeast. So preparing and baking bread was a time-consuming, arduous process from making yeast to knowing when the oven was ready. Commercial yeast was not available until 1868. And again, I'm talking about colonial, so we're in the 1700s at this time. So recipes for yeast occupy a large part of bread making sections in early cookbooks. Cooks would generally keep a starter on hand made with ingredients that included hops, potatoes, sugar, flour, and water. And then they combined with more flour to make a, quote, sponge. And the dough would be set to rise hours ahead of when it was to be eaten. Hours. Kneading was, and still is, a major part of the process, and its importance was emphasized. So a Mrs. Smith writes that, quote, the best bread makers who I know knead for at least an hour with all their might. And then Eliza Leslie noted that the goodness of bread depends much on the kneading. While Miss Leslie's statement holds true today, those lengthy times required for kneading are no longer necessary. The commercial yeast now available has shortened that process considerably. We take a lot of this stuff for granted, of how difficult it was just to make bread. Today it's so easy. The actual bread baking was normally done in Dutch ovens or brick ovens that if you had a larger kitchen, you could build in a brick oven into the side of your fireplace. But usually you just had these large kitchen fireplaces. And a thorough knowledge of the process was vital, how to use that hearth. So now, if you're using brick ovens, a fire was started in the brick ovens about 2 hours prior to putting in the loaves. Instructions for these were very specific, including the size and type of wood needed to get the proper oven temperature necessary to bake. Interesting skill, don't you think? Here's one quote for knowing the correct temperature. If you can hold your hand within the mouth of the oven as long as you can distinctly count 20, the heat is about right. Again, this took some skill, trial and error, maybe some burned fingers. Now, alternatively, with Dutch oven baking, it was necessary to preheat the iron kettle or the Dutch oven before putting in the prepared bread dough. And then once filled and covered, the Dutch oven could be suspended from the crane, remember, and hung over the fire. You just swing it over with this crane. And another method was to set the Dutch oven on the coals to bake in the corner of the hearth, and then additional hot coals would be piled on top of the lid, so it made like a little oven, a Dutch oven. There you go. Whatever the baking method, providing these delectable breads was essential during this time. So let's take a look at a colonial bread recipe and talk about how it will be prepared in a Dutch oven on a hearth. And I'll also give you the modern technique of how to do it. So this is Mary Randolph's cornmeal bread recipe. Now listen to this. This is the recipe. I'm going to read you the whole recipe. Rub a piece of butter the size of an egg into a pint of cornmeal. Make a batter with 2 eggs and some new milk. Add a spoonful of yeast, set it by the fire for an hour to rise, butter little pans, and bake it. Written by Mary Randolph. I kid you not, that's it. This is typical of recipes of this area. I've got so many books, and they're all like this. They're like these little one-paragraph things. You got simple measurements of weight or volume, a pint of cornmeal, a piece of butter the size of an egg. Vague measurements, a spoonful or some milk, how big of a spoon and how much is some milk. Sometimes they have no measurements at all. So you got to know which spoon to use. And what constitutes a little pan? You really had to know what you were doing to be able to follow these kinds of recipe instructions. We have some great recipes today. And I just happen to have this recipe complete with a modern list of ingredients, and you'll be able to give it a try with confidence. The instructions for baking this bread on the hearth are going to be there for you as well, just in case you want a really big adventure in baking. So I'm going to take Mary Randolph's recipe, all of the ingredients there, and then we're actually going to put actual measurements next to them and make this cornmeal bread. So what you need: 2 tablespoons of butter melted, 2 cups of milk, 2 cups of white cornmeal, 2 teaspoons of dried yeast, a teaspoon of salt, and 2 eggs. Now, if you were going to do it on the hearth, here's how you would do it. You'd heat the butter and milk until the milk is warm and the butter starts to melt, and then you set that aside to cool down to a lukewarm. All right, so you're just melting the butter and the milk. Then you're going to combine the cornmeal, the yeast, and the salt, the dry ingredients, and then you stir in the cooled milk and the butter, and then beat in the eggs lightly, stir in the rest of the yeast, and so on, and blend it well, but do not overmix. Then you're going to pour into a well-greased greasing pan, and you're going to set it aside to rise for 1 hour. And then you're going to take that pan and you're going to place it into a preheated Dutch oven. And again, you could set it on a trivet, you could set it on the crane, or you could put it in the on rocks. You could put it on rocks. You could put it in the corner of your hearth. All kinds of ways that you can use that Dutch oven. You're going to bake following the general instructions for Dutch oven baking for about 25 minutes, or until the knife inserted in the center comes out clean and the bread is a rich golden brown. Now note, I am not including the quote general instructions for Dutch oven baking. Email me if you want those instructions. All right, so here's how you'd make it today, really, if you're not going to do it on the hearth. So you're going to follow the hearth directions 1 through 4 using an 8 by 8 inch square pan, and then preheat your oven to 450. Bake the cornbread 20 to 30 minutes or until it's done. All right, so you follow the directions, putting it together and letting it rise, and then you're going to bake it in the oven at 450 degrees, 20 to 30 minutes. All right, final thoughts. I hope you enjoyed today's Farmcast. We will keep plugging away at that creamery and living the homestead life that fills us with wonder and awe. We love our cheese and can't wait to share it with you. Run on over to www.peacefulheartfarm.com to see what we've got cooking for you there. Every one of the recipes you hear on the Farmcast is there, as well as others. Sign up on our mailing list so you can receive our monthly newsletter filled with more cooking tips and tricks. From the basics of how to boil an egg in an Instant Pot to creating really fantastic and fun dishes like that cheese fondue recipe that was a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to shamelessly plug that. We had it just last week. It was a lovely romantic evening. There's a link in the show notes, and so you can go find that cheese fondue recipe, and there will be a link also to that cornbread recipe. You go visit our website. While our creamery is modern, the methods that we use are not. Striking that balance between using the traditions of yesteryear while taking advantage of modern technology it's the best of both worlds. Life in ancient times, or even just a couple hundred years ago, was filled with all sorts of dangers and pitfalls. Food was scarce. It required lots of time and effort to prepare it. And tradition was extremely important. Tending your hearth properly meant the difference between living and dying, or at the very least, losing everything you owned in a fire. Without modern food preservation, traditional techniques of preserving food were also the difference between life and death. You didn't have your pressure canner back then. The art of having safely prepared nutritious food year-round meant you and your children might live to a ripe old age. Cheese was a big part of food preparation, as were drying, pickling, smoking, and salting. These ancient food preservation techniques made living through the harsh winters possible. You know, it's so easy to take for granted what we have today and what we've endured to get here. And I'll speak on behalf of Scott and myself. Gratefulness fills our heart as we reflect on the old ways. We look forward to continuing to share our passion for preserving life with you. And as always, I'm here to help you taste the traditional touch. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, may God fill your life with grace and peace.